The future of AI cannot be decided by a handful of countries or left to the whims of a few billionaires. That was the message of UN Chief Antonio Guterres at the Global AI Summit, currently underway in India. The gathering in New Delhi is the fourth such summit and the first held in a developing nation. According to one annual global ranking of AI competitiveness, India is now third in the world after the US and China. For more on the future of AI, we can speak to Rachel Adams, the founder of the Global Center on AI Governance and the author of The New Empire of AI, The Future of Global Inequality. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm joining you from the Leaders Lounge at the summit in New Delhi.
And could you start by explaining your center's mission and your goals at this summit in particular?
Absolutely. So I lead the Global Center on AI Governance, which is a South African-based think tank that's supporting Global South policymakers to come together at the summit. So we have brought a cohort of AI policymakers from 5 African countries and 2 Asian countries together to the summit to participate in various engagements and to have workshops to really kind of operationalize what South-South collaboration can do at this particular moment.
This summit is being hosted by India, which is the only country from the Global South, I believe, that you could kind of call a leader in AI. Can you talk about India's position in the global AI race?
Well, I think what India is doing is trying to start from a different starting point, which is not around how do we build the most powerful technology, but how do we build technology that is fair and safe and useful for our country and our societies. And this is a vision that very, very much reflects with many other countries from across the Global South who are also at a moment where they're trying to define their vision for artificial intelligence and how it can help support in the realization of development priorities from healthcare to education to agriculture.
You mentioned that you're there, with 5 African countries and 2 Asian countries. Can you talk a little bit more about those countries and what AI technology is currently available? What does AI look like on the African continent?
Well, there are very exciting innovation communities from across these countries. We're working with Nigeria, with Ghana, with Kenya, South Africa, Rwanda, and Uganda. And I think the policymakers that we're working with, they're really trying to think about how do we enable these innovation communities to grow so that they can take the kind of products and innovations that they're building that may be sort of applications to support local farmers or educational tools that support teachers to be able to deliver more targeted educational offerings, or applications for nurses or primary healthcare workers to be able to support in the diagnostics that they're doing at local levels. So the policymakers we're working with are thinking about, well, how do we create the kind of enabling policy environment that supports the right kind of artificial intelligence? So that may be things like, how do we get rid of regulatory barriers that may impede really successful and useful and safe artificial intelligence? How do we provide more access to compute power for these innovators? How do we ensure they have access to data that's not including sensitive personal data, but data that many governments have in rich abundance and are very useful for defining and developing very kind of targeted AI solutions that are relevant to local contexts? And so the policymakers we're working with are thinking about, okay, how do we work together in developing standards that are applicable to our contexts, and we can kind of share the work and make it easier for all of us to move a little bit quicker.
And have you been making progress in those areas? For example, you mentioned access to computing powers.
Yes, and I think this is one of the areas where middle power countries are really trying to kind of move forward a new kind of alliance. So rather than thinking about how do we build massive compute centers in just one jurisdiction, how do we create compute capabilities through cloud services or edge computing that may be more available in a more distributed way? So the UAE, for example, has this new program of work around compute alliances that provide access to computing facilities, cutting edge frontier computing facilities to African innovators or Asian innovators, for example. So there's ways that we can do this that are more distributed and more shared, particularly when we're working with open source technologies.
And your book, which you published in 2023, warns that AI is on course to exacerbate global inequalities. Can you talk more about why that is?
I certainly can. So I think one of the things we're very concerned about is that the large scale adoption and acceleration of AI is going to have quite a significant impact on labor. I think this is the area that citizens across the global south are very, very worried about. If we think about countries like India that have built their economies around global digitalization through digital outsourcing or call centers, for example, these are precisely the kinds of tasks and roles and sectors that generative AI technologies can now take over wholesale. So it's really that these new technologies are not kind of impacting older legacy industries, but they're impacting and disrupting the very industries and sectors that were supposed to be at the heart of the kind of growth and economic growth and transformative growth for many emerging economies and middle power economies across the world.
Regulation is also a big issue when we talk about AI. What do you think should be the priority of regulators?
Well, I think we don't need to be thinking that we absolutely need to have global consensus at this point. I think we need to be thinking about having a shared set of principles and then developing standards and benchmarks that can be moderated and adjusted in different regional contexts. I think this is something that has come out very strongly across this conference, is that countries around the world have different political traditions and they have different regulatory needs. So Europe, for example, is regulating around kind of rights and quite firm regulation. The US is thinking about markets and innovation. China is thinking about state coordination. Across the global south, we see a much more kind of pragmatic adoption of different elements of these different kind of regulatory regimes and thinking much more about how do we create outcomes-based regulation with and for artificial intelligence that steers and governs this technology towards helping us achieve particular social outcomes in health or education. One area, of course, is that we want to see much stronger regulation around labor protections so that people whose jobs may be at risk are protected with social safety nets like unemployment schemes or upskilling programs.
Well, we hope it will be a fruitful summit for you. Rachel Adams, thank you again so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with us.